In this video, I'm going to review the 4 types of externalities as examples of market failure. So the first type of market failure due to externalities is the existence of positive externalities of production. When this happens, there's a problem of underproduction because the marginal private cost, MPC, is greater than the marginal social cost. As a result, the marginal social benefit is higher than the MSC. You can see here, because the producers base their production decisions on the MPC, as a result, the equilibrium quantity is less than the optimal quantity. At the equilibrium quantity, you can see the MSB is here, but the MSC is there. MSB is greater than MSC means that there's a potential welfare gain that could be captured if more of this product was produced. Examples are if a company provides training for its employees who may leave and take those skills elsewhere, or say, for example, a tree farm for chopping wood contributes to the re-oxygenation of the atmosphere. What are some interventions by the government to correct this type of market failure? Well, the government could subsidize the production of this product to shift the MPC to the right, closer to the MSC. So this would shift the MPC to the right, closer to the MSC, and bring the equilibrium quantity closer to the optimal quantity Q star. The government could also use legislation and regulation to encourage production of these goods/services. In this case, there's an external benefit spilling over from the production process, and the size of the external benefit is the vertical distance between the MPC and the MSC curve. Now, in the case of negative externalities of production, there is a problem of overproduction because the MPC is less, the marginal private cost is less than the MSC. There's an external cost spilling over from production process. As a result, the MSB is lower than the MSC. You can see producers are basing their supply decisions on the MPC over here because they are not taking into account the external cost, while the MSC, the marginal social cost, is higher. So think of the marginal social cost as the ideal supply, while the marginal private cost is the actual supply. This leads to the equilibrium quantity being higher than the optimal quantity. At this equilibrium quantity, you can see the marginal social cost is higher than the marginal social benefit. So there is a welfare loss, which is this shaded yellow triangle. Examples of negative externalities of production are production processes that create any sort of pollution: air pollution, water pollution, land pollution, dumping waste on land, littering, noise pollution, creating noise in a quiet residential neighborhood, light pollution, again creating excessive light in a quiet residential neighborhood. Also, other examples are production processes that use scarce resources at an unsustainable rate, like, for example, overfishing tuna fish and driving it to extinction. Now, what are some possible government interventions to correct this type of market failure? Well, the government could tax the production of this good or service, which would shift the MPC curve to the left, bringing it closer to the MSC. If the MPC curve shifts to the left, this would bring the equilibrium quantity somewhat closer to the optimal quantity. The government could also use legislation and regulation to discourage production of this good or service, or to raise the costs of production of this good or service, which would have the same effect. A popular solution is also the use of tradable permits. In the case of positive externalities of consumption, there is a problem of underconsumption because the marginal private benefit is less than the marginal social benefit. There is a benefit to society that's much greater than the benefit to the individual. As a result, the MSB is much higher than the MSC. Here, there's an external benefit spilling over from consumption. Examples are getting vaccinated or receiving an education, which doesn't just benefit the individual consuming the education, but the rest of society. Also, consuming health services. If everybody had regular checkups and took care of their health, there'd be less diseases and infections spreading around. So, in the case of positive externalities of consumption, you can see that the marginal social benefit is higher than the marginal private benefit. Think of the MPB curve as the actual demand, while the ideal demand is the MSB. curve. As a result, the equilibrium quantity that the market provides, QE, is less than the optimal quantity. Here, there's a potential welfare gain, which is this triangle here due to this underconsumption. Now, what are some interventions to correct this type of market failure? Similar to positive externalities of production, the government can use subsidization. Subsidizing production will shift the MSC to the right. So the government could encourage more production by shifting the MSC to the right. Alternatively, the government could also use legislation and regulation, like many governments make education compulsory up to a certain age. And the government could use positive advertising and use persuasion to try and shift MPB to the right. So interventions could either be used to increase supply or increase demand. Last, but definitely not least, is negative externalities of consumption. Here, there is a problem of overconsumption because the MPB is higher than the MSB. There's an external cost spilling over from consumption. As a result, the MSB is lower than the MSC. Examples are smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, gambling. All of these goods and services do not just impose costs on the individual consuming them, but on the rest of society. Now, as a result of this, the equilibrium quantity ends up being higher than the optimal quantity. There's a problem of overconsumption. As you can see, consumers base their consumption decisions on their marginal private benefit. So that's the actual demand. But the ideal demand from the point of view of society is the MSB. So there is overconsumption, okay? And due to this overconsumption, there's a welfare loss, which is this yellow triangle. You can see at the equilibrium quantity, the MSB is lower than the MSC. So what are some interventions that the government can use to correct this type of market failure? Well, the government could tax the production, which would shift the MSC curve to the left. So maybe try and tax, which would increase the cost of production, and create a new MSC curve, which is MSC plus tax. That's one approach. The government could also use legislation and regulation. Governments tend to have minimum ages for the consumption of cigarettes and alcohol, for example, or banning smoking or the consumption of alcohol in certain areas, only allowing it in other areas. The government could also rely on negative advertising and persuasion in an attempt to shift the MPB to the left. So either try to decrease demand by using negative advertising, legislation, regulation, or try to decrease supply by using indirect taxes, taxing the production. I hope you found this review of the 4 types of externalities somewhat useful. Please let me know if you have any questions in the comments and I will respond to them.